wind project development, some counties in Missouri and some other locations in other states have tight regulations to limit access to wind and other renewable energy projects. Our expert panelists will discuss new regulations in Missouri and the rest of the country, as well as their impact on current and future renewable energy projects in local communities. I'm pleased today for our panel here today, we have Hillary Clark, Director of Social License, Siting and Permitting, the American Clean Power Association, James Owen, Executive Director of Green Missouri, and Gina Mace, Manager of Public Policy and Institutional Affairs at the NEL North America. Thank you all very much for participating with us today. So for the audience, it's going to be a Q&A panel discussion. So I'll let them go and view what they have to say. So the first question I have for you is, what has been the trajectory of wind project developments over the last several years? What does that forecast look like going forward? We'll go ahead and start James work down.
Hope everyone can hear me. Okay, that's better. You know, from our perspective, our group, Renew Missouri, we work on clean energy policy advocacy. We do a lot of that in front of the Public Service Commission. You know, I feel like, you know, with wind, you have seen a lot of development in Missouri. You've seen that coming from Ameren, you've seen that coming from Evergy, you've seen that certainly coming from Liberty Empire. You've got a lot of private developers working on that too. But I feel like, you know, with the investor utilities where we, you know, kind of exist in that space, being in front of the regulators in Jefferson City, is you're seeing sort of more of a shift to large scale, utility scale solar. The wind is there, the wind is being used, the wind remains controversial. It remains controversial in areas of the state where they don't have zoning, they don't have ordinances, they just generally have a lot of noise. They have a lot of people that are still concerned. I was just reading an article last week where a county commissioner in Southwest Missouri was raising concerns about one of the wind farms that Liberty Empire had built was offline, and he was concerned about that. He had been concerned about whether they were going to build in the first place. He was concerned about flashing red lights having an impact on those areas, but now the flashing red lights are on, so he's concerned about that now too. So even though we've seen a lot of development in wind, and we've seen a lot of efforts to go in that direction, we're going to start seeing more large-scale projects for not only wind, but also for solar. We still have the people who have concerns, you know, how valid they are or not. They are still there, and they're still making an issue out of that. So we like what's happening, we like what's happening, but we still think there's a lot of people that have a lot of misinformation about wind around the state.
Can you all hear me? Okay, so from a developer's perspective, working for Enel North America, we are a developer, long-term owner and operator of wind and solar projects and really renewable plants in general. And so echoing what James had mentioned and saying that there's a lot of misinformation about wind, that's our biggest challenge, is really combating that misinformation. But we do see a really strong trajectory in Missouri and the Midwestern states for wind. You know, in Missouri, it's really governed at the local level. So we're working with county commissioners, planning and zoning boards, as well as the community themselves. So it's really making sure that we have open lines of communication. We're working with those community stakeholders. So when they have questions about how wind works, or about the blinking red lights, or about setback distances, we can really educate them on what that looks like from a developer's perspective, but then also work with them so we are taking into account what works for the community. You know, if we're building on agricultural land, you know, obviously that comes into play, and we're working on the siting and permitting part of that. So the growth is there. It's just building in communities that are open, receptive to having those conversations. And so excited, you know, as we continue to grow and working with the IOUs in the state and continuing to work with communities and helping educate them and finding solutions that work for all of us.
Hear me? Oh, here we go. I don't have a whole lot to add from their perspective. I mean, they think they hit it pretty well. I would say, you know, in general, across the United States, we are seeing some opposition and some concern over wind energy. But as we've kind of heard today, people want the renewable energy. It is still moving forward. The majority of communities do see the benefit and do want to see it. I do have some statistics on where Missouri ranks in wind energy. This was as of December, at the end of December last year. In Missouri, Missouri ranks 18 in the wind capacity, the online wind capacity. Wind generation rank is 20 in the United States. There's about 10 manufacturing facilities within Missouri, and the pipeline rank is 25th in the United States. So it's still moving forward. We do see things are going to start moving upward. I don't have the data for the first quarter of 2022. That will come out sometime mid this month, maybe a little bit later this month. But that's where everything is in Missouri. So I think you're still going to see that trajectory happen.
I'm glad you mentioned that last part. You all kind of talked about where we stand right now and what you're seeing. Do you see those issues impeding the increased development of wind, or do you feel that those issues that you raised are such that they're easily, for lack of a better phrase, explained away? For someone who's willing to listen, you can do that, and therefore the projects will continue to build.
Is that this misinformation, which is coming largely from, legitimate concerns. People are worried about where they live, what that's going to look like, what is going to define their community for a long time. And those are legitimate concerns. Anytime anything changes, anytime anything's new, people are going to ask those questions. The concern is that those legitimate questions are being exploited and largely being done through misinformation. It's being set through social media to exaggerate, to provide outright, incorrect, lies in some cases, which get picked up by these concerned citizens, and then ultimately filters to policymakers and lawmakers in these communities. I mean, these are the people who are concerned about this are listening to the people who are calling them, are emailing them, who are showing up to meetings. Those, generally speaking, are people who are opposed to wind. They're there, they're signing all of these things that sound so outrageous, they almost couldn't be false, because why else would anyone say them? And I think the problem you've got is, that's the information that some of these people are getting. When I talk about county commissioners, we talk about other people like state representatives who, are trying to put forth limitations on where this wind generation can go. And so for me, I think just like anybody else has concerns about the information going from social media to the general public, because we heard a lot about that about the 2016 election. We hear a lot about that with general discourse. It's not that much different here from what we're seeing. And so my concern is not so much that, obviously you have facts, you have figures, you have people who are, trying to appeal to people's reason. A person can be reasonable. People sometimes, I think, will get somewhat, they'll see these things and they'll react negatively to it. And so lawmakers, policymakers are going to respond to that. So my concern is that there's a deliberate effort to put that threat out there, and it is influencing how, influencing the laws of how these things are built and where they're staying. And I'm concerned about whether or not those are going to have real impacts.
To build off of that, so in developing in some counties, we see that county commissioners are amenable to our project and want to have conversations with us. But then some of the problem that we face is they will create or introduce an ordinance where they will limit turbine height to a height that doesn't allow for a wind farm to be built, right? So then comes the hard part of helping educate that on its face, your ordinance looks like it's friendly to wind, but really the way it's written, we can't actually develop in your county. And so not only are we facing obstacles related to misinformation, but we're also having to educate individuals on how the technology is advancing and continuing to get better. For instance, we hear conversations often about decibel levels and how loud turbines may be. And so a lot of times we'll see county commissioners that want to limit the turbine height, when in reality, if you're able to bring in larger turbines, you're putting less of them within a mile, so you're decreasing your density. So again, it's just really educating the policymakers and the elected officials that are making these decisions. And so that, coupled with the misinformation, it's certainly an uphill battle, but we're making progress when individuals are willing to listen and when individuals understand the economic contributions that these projects can make to their community and to the state.
I think it's important to also understand that a lot of times this mischaracterization or misinformation is based on anecdotal evidence. I mean, somebody can say, that staring at that wind turbine made me dizzy. What were they staring at a wind turbine for, if you're looking up for a long period of time, you might get a little bit dizzy staring at something, but they attribute that to the wind turbine actually doing something to them. And it's based on an anecdotal evidence. You might hear that, the wind turbine syndrome being causing health impacts, the sound of the wind turbine making somebody sick. Again, that's a lot of that is largely based on anecdotal evidence. There's no scientific data to that. However, when you have the opposition may be small in number, but they can be very, very loud, and they really work on fear tactics and really pushing this information, which can, and sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that people start to listen to. So when you kind of look at the community, there's probably a lot of people that want the benefits. They want to see the renewable energy come in. However, there's a group that's being louder and kind of just pushing this information that's really scary. If you start kind of going down that rabbit hole of opposition, it can get a little bit scary if you don't understand it. And when new industry comes into an area, especially a rural community, it's new. They may not understand what goes into building these projects, how much information is put into actually siting the turbines, talking to the landowners, seeing what fits best for the community. So there's a lot that goes on that many people don't see that happens behind the scenes. And I think it kind of just shows that, early communication with the community, not just the policymakers, the regulators, is key in an important piece of the process.
So Gina, you mentioned a specific policy about the height of a windmill. I'd like for the audience, because I'm not sure everyone understands or knows what happened in Boone County. So I'd like to drill down on a specific example that we have in Missouri. What was that policy that they implemented? What is the first thing I'd like to have addressed, and then from there, what you think the rationale and impact will be.
So when I just referenced that height restriction, that did come out of Boone County. And while we're not actively developing a wind project in Boone County, we do have a solar project there. And so we do follow closely what's going on in Boone County. But for that specific example, so they passed an ordinance that would limit turbine height to 263 feet. And I can tell you that we built a wind project up in Nottoway County that has, at the time of 2017, when it was completed, the max height of our turbines was 350 feet, which at the time was excessive. So to fast forward 5 years later and to cap that height at 263 feet, well, you're not going to have a wind farm in your county if that's the restriction or the limitation you're setting. So that specifically did come out of Boone County, and that ordinance, they also talk about decibel levels, and they wanted it to be 40 decibels, if I remember correctly. And at that level, again, you're really saying that a wind project can't be built in your county, because even on some of its best days, we may be able to meet a 45 decibel level. We aim for 50. which when you look at those levels, it's really similar to the sound of a refrigerator in your home. And so when you limit it at 40, you're really limiting the project being built. And so those are just two of the examples that came out of that ordinance. There was also a limitation on output capacity that was really around abandonment language, saying that if you reduced your capacity output to a 20% level for at least 6 months, then it would trigger that wind turbine was abandoned. And the issue with something like that on its face, again, it looks like it would be reasonable, but whenever there may be an issue related to a turbine, repair may be needed or maintenance may be needed, it can press up against that 6 months, depending on what the logistics may look like for bringing in, a new part or trucking something up from a different state. And not to say that we would always press up against that 6-month timeline, but you have to factor in any new permits that you may have to receive or any other siting restrictions. So again, really trying to create an ordinance that's reasonable to the community, the landowners, but also the developer's perspective as well. And I know James can speak much more about that specific ordinance, but those are the 3 big items that stuck out to me when I reviewed it.
I would like to say that on the sound limit, I believe in Boone County, the sound limit being 40 decibels was set at the property line, not the residence, not the outset. So typically when you're looking at the sound limit, it's really the internal sound that you're hearing inside of a residence. So you look at what would that sound level be at the outside exterior wall closest to the object making the sound. And Boone County wanted to set that at the property line. So then if you think about the size of the properties where they're and how far that house might be from the property line, you've now eliminated large pieces of your neighbor's land where he could not assign a turbine, could not have a turbine on his land because of how restrictive that sound fit is at the property line. So I think that was, again, they didn't quite, it wasn't, I believe that they just weren't understanding kind of how turbines are sited in relation to property line versus residences and kind of the distancing measuring, how that impacts how you site those turbines. So you're adding extra setback onto the turbine.
When you look at that ordinance, the Boone County, Missouri ordinance, all of the setbacks involve going from, where we're placing these turbines to the property line, not to a residence. That even include if you're the same owner of 2 different parcels, you could not place a wind turbine within a property line, even if you own the other property. Okay, that's how these were written. Now, it allowed the elected officials who voted for this to say, well, this is not anti-wind. This is something that's just a reasonable restriction. Well, based on what you've heard this panel talk about, there's no way that any of those conditions would exist for any wind turbine to be placed in Boone County at all. And in fact, the person that was partially responsible for writing these ordinances was a volunteer. It's an engineer who also happened to be a landowner who lived near some of these proposed areas, had signed anti-wind petitions. All of that's public record. Yeah, they can still sit there and say this is reasonable, but it's clear that the bias against wind and the desire to make sure it could not be built in the county was baked into the way it was written. So I certainly think that there was a limitedness to how that was written, but also in ways so they could say we're not banking it, we're just restricting it, but restricting it out of existence.
So that's interesting. You have a specific example there of an individual in a central location. And for all of us from Missouri, we definitely know, right, whether you're rural Missouri or urban, there's a difference in policy and regulation. And if you're northern Missouri versus southern Missouri, there's again a different kind of perspective. Thinking of Greenbelt Express as an example. Do you with the explanation you gave of that volunteer being local and a property owner that was going to be impacted, do you see this replicating?
I know it's going to replicate because when we did a sunshine law request of Boone County and the commission's, all of their emails, all of their documents involving this ordinance. We saw emails where the county commissioner was sending this to Knox County as an example in Northeast Missouri. That's not very far from the Iowa border. There's a lot of anti-wind opposition there as well. They said, hey, if we've written this, maybe you could find this useful. That was an email that was sent. So useful, and sending that to someone that they knew was opposed to these projects. So, clearly there is an effort to help replicate this. It is tougher in some of these counties because, well, as an example, I'll tell you, I'm from Webster County, which is in Southwest Missouri. They tried to get the countywide zoning passed there back in the early 2000s 3 times, never successful. So a lot of these counties don't have ordinances where this can be attacked, but they'll do other things. And like right now, as an example, in Callaway County, where you have a very large scale solar project being contemplated there, a city council, New Bloomfield, wrote an ordinance declaring solar as a nuisance. It's a nuisance. And I don't know how enforceable that ordinance is going to be, but the people who are opposed to this, look, they're dealing with. Listen, let's also be clear here. I'm not trying to, planning and zoning commissions, these citizen groups that are involved with this, they don't get paid. They are doing this because it's something that interests them. Maybe they have other motivations. That's going to be more prevalent in smaller counties where you don't have a large scale government like you might have here in Jackson County or Boone County or wherever. So you're going to rely a lot on citizens to be involved with that process. And sometimes those people are going to have, tensions that might not be within the public good or balancing public interest. There's what can you do about that? I mean, honestly, when you've got a decentralized state like Missouri, where we don't have statewide building codes, we don't have statewide standards for these things, you're going to start seeing more and more of that. So until the state starts looking at that, I mean, look, there was a representative who fought for that statewide wind kind of standard, but it was, standard in a way that probably, curb development. But I think, that might be something that has to be considered. We should be having something that sets the standard, because there are just people that are in these rural counties that neither have the laws nor the staffing that can adequately deal with it.
Yeah, I would just say, in a lot of times, and this is not just unique to Missouri, but in a lot of states, when you have rural communities that either don't have zoning codes, they don't zone, or their zoning codes are very limited in what they're regulating. And oftentimes they will just look to their neighbor to see, well, if their neighbor has a code for renewable, either wind, solar, storage, they'll say, let's just do what they did. But if that neighboring county wrote a very restrictive ordinance for the purpose of not inviting industry in, then you all of a sudden are having a risk to that ordinance being picked up by your neighboring counties. We see that often. And a lot of times those ordinances, those restrictive ordinances, then get picked up and moved to neighboring states. You kind of see them all of a sudden. I've seen an ordinance from a township in Michigan show up in Colorado almost word for word at the county, because somebody said, here, use this as your example. And that ordinance in that township in Michigan was written specifically to kill wind development that was occurring. And it was to kill one project, but they ended up just killing the entire industry there. So I think that's an important thing to think about when you're looking into, when the industry is moving into a rural area that may not have an ordinance, maybe engaging a little bit sooner in the conversations of how these projects are actually sited, what goes into the engineering behind it. And there's been a study out with the University of Michigan, partnered with the Land and Liberty Coalition, and they did a study, they did a research where the preliminary data showed that counties that were proactive in developing their regulations, so if they anticipated the industry coming in and they proactively engaged and wrote their ordinances and got them in place, then opposition to the industry and kind of the restrictive ordinances in place were less than counties that became reactive. The industry moved in, started prospecting, looked at permitting their project, and then the county said, wait, hold on, we don't have regulations, we need to develop regulations. That sometimes backfired. And you see temporary moratoria going in while they develop the regulations that then kind of creates this spiral of potential restriction.
So the examples that you're giving do seem to be very localized in local ordinances, county ordinances. Are you seeing any state taking any action?
I mean, there are states that have state level regulations. It's more common on the East Coast for the states to kind of regulate at the utility scale level. Some states around are looking at developing kind of backstop siting regulations where it's sort of like a voluntary, we've written a model ordinance for counties to adopt. Not a lot of states have done that, but there are some that are looking at doing that. And then we also see states that are like, you know, a little less friendly to the renewable industry, and they're trying to put in state legislation that could potentially, you know, curtail the development in that state. So you kind of, it varies from state to state, you know, what they're doing at the state level versus what they're doing at the local level.
Chime in on that. You know, our neighboring state of Kansas, this last legislative session, we saw from one elected official, he introduced 8 anti-renewable bills, and they were all primarily aimed at wind. And it was to cite or restrict siting rather at the state level. And so I share that because while we haven't seen that number of bills introduced in Missouri that want to restrict wind or anti-renewables, at least at that level, it is something that in the Midwest, it doesn't always echo what we see on the coastal or in the coastal states. So in theory, it can sound really great to have a statewide plan, but as James alluded to, depending on what that plan actually looks like or what that, you know, codified state law would look like, it's not always reasonable or friendly to renewable projects.
I was thinking of Kansas as well, and I know that it, you know, there was a push there. It got a legislative hearing. There was leadership that was in favor of this kind of statewide, what would effectively prohibition. The version of that in Missouri has not received really any kind of play, and I think it's largely because utility companies don't like this. Utility companies have a lot of sway in the state capitals around here, as they showed. They are regulated through entities that keep their power from the legislature, and that's where they know they've got to be involved and engaged. I mean, I think that, you know, ultimately, yeah, prop is always like designed to kill something. There's always designed like to like undo something they don't like the local government. There's nothing done where you talk to you know, utility professionals, talk to engineers, you know, talk to local leaders, try to figure out there's a way that can like make this uniform. Yeah, certainly you can understand like some of the, you know, some coastal areas, you know, the states might be a little smaller. You know, that you would want to have statewide issues with that. Now what we're seeing, just, yeah, I think I forgot who said reactionary policy. Hillary was talking reactionary policies. There's no effort to try to like say, well, how are we going to balance the interest of landowners who, you know, want to protect the property rights versus landowners who want to be able to profit off of this, or like the fact that we need to be building more wind in areas where they have quote unquote good wind. That is, you know, better, and, you know, not to mention the fact, I think Josh mentioned this in one of his questions, you know, the challenges you've got, the political will you've got moving that wind after it's been generated. And the fact that you have a transmission project that's been dealt with Missouri, dealt with in Kansas, dealt with in Illinois. Well, at least Missouri has been fought over since 2014. We've been fighting about Greenbelt Express for 8 years, and we're still fighting about it in the Missouri legislature. 3 years after the Public Service Commission approved it, we're still talking about it. So, is there political will at the statewide level? This is the conference on infrastructure to deal with those infrastructure issues. Man, I don't know. It's certainly not one that feels very well informed to me at times.
I think that was a question to you. Does anybody think there is the will? We have no hands. I guess, Gina, was part of the discussion in Kansas the reason it did pass? Did the economic development impact of the existing fields have anything to do with the ability to kill it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's usually one of our strongest talking points whenever we're developing in communities where there may be pushback, or at the state level when there's pushback, because in looking at the economic contributions that we can bring into a community. So, jumping back over to Missouri, but speaking to one of our wind farms there. So we have a White Cloud wind project in the northern part of the state. And that project itself is going to bring in over $43 million in tax revenue over its lifetime. We're also going to be paying out over $56 million to landowners where we're leasing off of their property. And that's always not only an important talking point from the developer perspective, but from the landowners themselves. They have property rights, that's their land. They want to be able to use it as they see fit. And so giving them that option, if they want to place a wind turbine on their land, then allowing them to do so. So to answer your question, that's always a very important talking point, because we're giving those payments to landowners, but then we're also investing in the community when it comes to jobs and employing construction workers, full-time employees, even after the wind farm is fully operational. But then we're also, from Hanel's perspective, it's very important for us to invest in those communities. And speaking as a local Missourian or a native Missourian, I've lived here nearly my entire life. And so it's important to me that I know that we are making these contributions at the local and state level, because that impacts me personally, that impacts my bills that I'm paying, or my utility bills. So the economic piece is always an important talking point. And to your specific question, Kansas, that helped defeat those bills, and really allowing those local landowners to have their voice heard and say, no, we want wind projects in our community. And this is what it's done for us. And this is the money that's gone to our public schools because of this, or, these are the investments that have gone to emergency services because you all have developed here. So that's very important.
So I do have some economic statistics as well for Missouri. And this is just the wind energy. This doesn't include any of the solar storage development that could be occurring. So in the total investment of wind energy in Missouri at the end of last year was $3.7 billion in total investment. State and local taxes were over $15 billion, and land lease payments were close to 16 million, over 15 million in land lease payments. So this is for the state as a whole. I don't have them broken down by county there. And the installed wind capacity was 2,425 megawatts, with 14 projects online by the end of last year. So it does bring in a good amount of economic benefit to the state and to local governments.
Real fast. Just had an announcement that Facebook is building a data center here in Kansas City, $800 million project, creating 100 jobs. One of the reasons that they, finalized that deal was because the Public Service Commission got a petition from Evergy, so they could provide and produce, offset all the power that data center is using with renewable energy. So this is something that businesses are looking to when they relocate, they're looking what kind of access do we have to renewable power. That's not necessarily all going to be coming from Missouri. That's not all going to be coming from Kansas. That's all going to largely be coming from the marketplace that we're in. And so that's also another factor in economic development too. That there are businesses where we move where they get that power.
That's a great point. Before we dive into the other questions here, I want to give an opportunity for the audience to hop in. Does anybody have any questions for the panel?
Thank you all. I'm John Stevens, City Utility Springfield, Missouri. And I'm just wondering if you could all speak about the issues surrounding generator interconnection and cost allocation for that.
Start by saying clearly the interconnection queue is backlogged. I know we had someone up here earlier, a panel speaking to the transmission queue, and that is probably one of our biggest hurdles in developing projects, other than the local opposition we may have, is ensuring that we can connect, right? Because if we're not close to where we're wanting to send this power to, then, comes the issue of battery storage, and looking into that is another option. But without going into specifics about the cost, and I recognize that it's a huge problem, I believe, for all developers, whether that's solar or wind, and something we're continuing to work on, with our work groups with SPP and for MISO, depending on where projects are located. But I do know I want to say it's around 5 to 6 year study process. And so, there's also been issues that we've seen some projects that will enter the queue and they'll just sit, and then they have to renew their studies, and then they're sitting there longer. And so it continues to backlog. But I'll leave it at that, and recognizing what you're saying. And it is a huge issue, and one that I wish I had the answers to, but it sounds like this PP is making strides in the right direction and doing some reevaluation of what that queue looks like.
Anyone else? Okay.
You're starting to see it. I think I mentioned Callaway County, which is just due east of Boone County, Fulton. That's actually where the Ameren nuclear power plant is. NextEra is looking to build a very sizable solar solar field there, and you are seeing very well organized opponents to that. They are putting out information. Saying, I'm hearing things like the glare off of solar panels is actually causing a hole in the ozone layer. That's an example. And they're trying to say that these things are bad for the environment. And, I know you hear a lot of people who are concerned, because another thing too, we kind of alluded to this. I mean, wind production in this state, wind generation in the state does help produce property tax revenue. Right now, there's a law in Missouri that says if you're running solar, if you've got a big solar array, you don't pay property taxes on that equipment. There's a law that says that. There have been a lot of legal challenges to that law that's brought forward by the county assessors. There's an ongoing effort in the Missouri legislature to try to change that. I think the opinion of two of us up here that have to deal with solar, we are concerned about now. Being too high of a rate, we are trying to work actively to get that to be something that's more manageable. It's actually going to not bankrupt the solar industry. But I do think a lot of this opposition is coming from people who, in addition to wanting to see tax revenue, like your school districts, and that's fair enough. But it's also coming from large farm operators who often rent smaller parcels from other farms, and now they see that you can't compete with the kind of leases that they get from solar arrays. So they're trying to figure out ways to kill these projects because they want to use that for profit still, and they don't want to compete with with solar companies to get access to that land. And so again, it's another situation where there are economic motivators that are out there that are kind of putting out this misinformation, taking advantage of people's real legitimate concerns to try to kill something. Will it work in Callaway County? I don't know. I know that there's a lot of people working on that. and but we are, but I have seen it there. And with Boone County as an example, they passed these not a ban wind farm ban. They're looking at solar ordinances themselves. So I would say that while we haven't seen the same level for wind, I think it's coming for solar for sure.
Yeah, I would say that, across the US, that we are seeing an uptick in opposition to solar projects, utility scale solar projects. I will say that, opposition to wind groups, the larger groups and even some of the smaller groups have kind of picked up the torch for solar. So, they may have traditionally been against wind, but then when solar started moving in, they decided they were against solar as well. So it was, not unique to the wind. It was just renewables in general. And, opposition is not unique to the renewable energy industry. You certainly see opposition to other industries. I mean, I think you mentioned data centers being one. You do find there was interesting. Someone brought up an interesting note regarding an article that was in the Wall Street Journal recently, and he read some quotes from the opposition that sounded, and he didn't specify what they were opposing at the time. He's like, I'm just going to read these quotes and see how this, how people feel. And it was, I mean, you could have said, oh, that's a solar project, or oh, that's a wind project. It was an Amazon distribution center. The community where this was being proposed and built was against it, but basically what they were saying was what you might hear for wind and solar. So it's not a new thing, and it's not unique to this industry. It's just, we're having to deal with it and deal with those unique specifics with regards to misinformation and mischaracterization of data that's out there. And, and a lot of times you see on opposition groups where they use those fear tactics based on, they show images that might be old, but they're clipping them, reshaping them, and repurposing them as if this were something that happened yesterday, when that's not the case.
Yes, we got a question here.
I had a quick question about you said they're waiting to connect the wind power to the grid. Is that because of actual construction issues, or are we anywhere close to saturating the grid with some of these renewables without having a baseline load to offset when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing?
I know. So to answer your question, I think that there's transmission congestion across the board, regardless of which RTO we're speaking to, whether that's the PJM market, MISO, SPP. I don't think it's specifically tailored only to renewables. I think that there's an overall issue with transmission, and I think a complete overhaul of how we study projects and the process in which they go through needs to be looked at very closely, specifically for renewables. I can't speak to what that looks like as much for other generation sources, but for renewables, I do know that it is congested. We're sitting on that queue for quite some time. So we have several projects that we've identified we would like to start the beginning stages of developing them and speaking with landowners, but they're sitting right now until we have a better idea of not only what the queue will look like, but if a transmission line is going to get built, because there's plans for it, but that could be 6, 7, 8 years from now. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very high level answer, but that's probably the best answer I can give at this right now.
I just add, I think anytime you talk about renewable generation, you talk about the challenges of building wind, we have to talk about the challenges of building transmission. I mean, I know that this is something that's being studied by these regional organizations, but look, where I do a lot of my work is in Jefferson City. There is a pending bill that is almost being, that is in front of the Senate right now that would give county commissioners a veto power over a transmission project that goes across the state. There is a lot of people that are concerned about how eminent domain is used for transmission. But ultimately, those same people, know that power has to be made delivered to places where people live. It has to be delivered to Kansas City, St. Louis, and Chicago over to the East Coast. But and then you look at, forget about Missouri for a second. There was just a vote in Maine where a transmission line was voted down. It was put on the ballot. This ballot initiative to kill this transmission project, bring hydropower. This is not, I don't think we call hydro renewable Missouri. It's not so. There's hydropower coming from Canada that was being delivered to Boston. I believe it's where it was. But groups like the Sierra Club, and forgive me if you're sitting here, but there were a lot of environmental groups that were opposed to this transmission project to bring cleaner power to larger areas. And, it's even something that is talk about tension among landowners and local government. You have tension on wind transmission from environmental groups who say that wind kills too many birds, that sets habitats, even though there are lots of federal and statewide regulations that, and not to mention the fact that project specific, agreements between parties to make sure that wildlife issues are being mitigated. And I think that's very important. I think that gets built up. I think there's a real tension. The same people that were opposed to dam projects back in the 70s and nuclear power projects in the 70s are going to still have the same impulses to be opposed to transmission lines and wind farms. And so I even think, even though if you're a dirt eating druid like me, and you're an environmentalist, you're still going to have, you're still going to find a position in stuff. The dirt eating druid line usually is about the left. Sorry, I was trying to self-advocate, but that's something that's also a challenge from the left.
Any other questions? All right, any closing thoughts?
So in speaking to preserving the land, I will say that from a developer's perspective, we take a lot of pride in the work that we do and ensuring that whenever we are decommissioning a project or removing it from its useful life, that we are putting the land back to how it was previously, if not in a better condition. And when we are building our projects, we do have a lot of statewide and federal permitting that we have to go through. And so there's even instances where we've been able to build a road. And so those in the community have been able to use that as well. And so it's been a mutually beneficial relationship for us and the landowners. And, looking to the solar side of our business, we have solar farms where we've been able to incorporate the natural habitat and preserve the wildlife or the species there and the native prairie, whatever it may be, and really work with the farmers in the area and the landowners to ensure that we are preserving that land. And so that, it's a feel good as a developer, but it's also really important for the community to see that their land is still productive and useful, even with our projects on it.
I would also like to add, I know that a lot of this conversation was sort of the doom and gloom of opposition, but it's really, there is a good outlook for the industry. I mean, people do want renewables. If they didn't, we wouldn't be moving forward. I mean, and if you look at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab did a study, a 4-year study, where they looked at houses within 5 miles of wind energy projects. And it was an ongoing 4-year study where they pulled all that data and they looked at, millions of people living in this area within 5 miles. And ultimately, the study revealed that about 92% of people living within 5 miles of a wind project were not bothered by the wind project. They didn't have negative outlook of the wind project. So, it does show that for the most part, communities do want to see these projects. And right now we just happen to be in a time when the opposition groups are the loudest, most aggressive people in the room. And so you're going to get more attention when you're the loudest, most aggressive person in the room. And, but I do think we do have a positive outlook on these projects. We're certainly going to need to have, wind industry can't carry the decarbonization by itself. You're going to have wind, solar, storage, other renewable sources. So I think this industry does have good growth, and I will note, because I have my statistics here. The Energy and Information Administration, U.S. Energy Information Administration, there was a report recently that on March 29th, wind energy was the second largest contributor to energy on the grid.
All sound like a lot of problems. I would re-emphasize it. I think there's a lot of positive things to take away from this. I think any problem presents a solution. And I think whether you're here, as someone who wants to produce renewables or, run a natural gas combustion system or, small nukes or transmission lines or whatever it is you're doing as far as energy goes, trying to build the relationships, build the trust in those communities. My experience has been the earlier a business can get in there and talk to leadership, talk to the landowners, talk to the people that are going to be the ones that, are going to have to be the tough step. That's just like throwing money. That's not saying we're going to build you a softball park, but that's saying, let's talk about how we can come up with a solution to this. They want to know they're being listened to. Because I think one of the biggest challenges you've got in rural America right now, I can say this about as someone from rural America, we feel like the economy is passing us by, and it has to a large extent. And we just kind of see well, people are just going to build this stuff here because I don't think anything else is happening here. And so I think if they think that, they're going to have a lot of risk of this initially. So whatever it is you're doing, whatever your interest is that you're here for, I think just trying to make sure that you go in there with good intentions of being a good corporate neighbor and make sure you're working with them. I think that these problems can be overcome. I think, obviously companies are already doing that. I'm not telling anybody new, but I think sometimes people think, well, we can buy our way out of this, or, we have such a good idea of how can anyone not see our side of it. But that's just not the case. I mean, it's got to be two-way street. So.
Well, I appreciate that. And yes, this was a little of a downer panel. But part of the reason that we wanted to bring this up is this was something new. It was one thing to have NIMBY for a waste site or a nuclear power plant, but for many years, especially in Missouri, it wasn't seen that a solar field or a wind farm was going to be that big of a problem. But it's here, so it definitely should open the eyes of folks that are interested in it, whether you're a property owner or a business that is connected to it. That preparedness, transparency, and good communication are going to be what is needed, and getting in front of everything. And as history pointed out, is getting that myth of the development is definitely key. So I do apologize about that, but it was a little bit of this that we could all use. So thank you all very much for participating. Sorry. Our next session actually is a break. There are snacks in the hallways. We're going to have a break for 15 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, 2:30. We will come back. Before you go to the break and get back, we have the mayor's office and isolate